She had not known anyone was listening. That was the first truth. And it was the one that would undo everything. The morning room at Ashvale Park had been empty when Nora entered it at 6:30, the fire barely caught, the pale October light pressing cold and thin against the tall windows. She had come to find a mislaid letter from the lending library, nothing more. And she had found instead Lady Hargreaves' embroidery basket tipped behind the settee, and the gray cat asleep on the windowsill, and the long case clock ticking its measured indifference into the silence. She had found, she believed, absolute solitude. She had not found it. She had found the Duke of Asheville. He stood behind the curtain to the right of the window, still as stone, the heavy damask falling in a straight line from ceiling to floor and concealing him entirely save for the toe of one boot. Nora did not see the boot. She saw the cat, and the clock, and the spilled embroidery silks, and she set about tidying them with the brisk economy that 9 months of service at Ashvale had taught her, speaking to herself in the way she had always spoken to herself when no one was present, which is to say, with full honesty and no ornament at all. "He is testing her again," she said, gathering a skein of rose-colored silk from the hearthrug. She meant Lady Hargreaves' newest companion, Miss Alderton, who had arrived a fortnight ago from Bath, and was being measured daily against some invisible standard. He sets a small trap, and then watches to see if she walks into it. I wonder if he has ever considered that the people he sets his traps for are simply tired. She paused, pressing the silk to her palm. "I wonder," she said more quietly, to no one, "if he has ever considered that being watched without one's knowledge is not a test of character. It is a trespass." The clock ticked. The cat did not stir. And behind the curtain, the Duke of Asheville stood very still and listened to a maid address a philosophical objection to his household management, her voice low and entirely without deference, as though she were settling the question for herself alone. He did not move. He did not speak. He would think about what she had said for 4 days. Her name was Nora Baxter, and she had come to Ashvale in the January of that year with a letter of character from the vicar of Stilton Parish, and very little else. She was 23 years old, slight and not especially tall, with the kind of face that most rooms decided was unremarkable at a glance, and then found themselves returning to without quite knowing why. Her hair was dark brown, worn in a smooth knot at the back of her head under her cap, and her hands were the hands of someone who had worked since she was old enough to be useful, red at the knuckles, and deliberate in everything they did. The Ashvale housekeeper, Mrs. Pelham, had engaged her on the strength of the letter and 3 minutes of conversation about the proper maintenance of fire grates in rooms with north-facing windows, after which she had said, "You'll do," and shown her the back stairs. Nora had been shown the back stairs at 4 other households before this one. She knew how they went. What she had not expected was Ashvale itself, which was a house of considerable and very particular character. It had been the seat of the Dukes of Asheville for 6 generations, and it wore its age the way a person who has outlived most of their contemporaries wears theirs, with dignity and an occasional sharpness that reminded you of old griefs without narrating them. The tapestries in the long gallery were faded to a kind of luminous gray. The staircase banister was polished to a warm reddish bronze. In the library, the shelves reached the ceiling, and there were 2 chairs drawn up before the fire that had not been moved, Nora suspected, in a very long time. The current Duke had not been in residence when she arrived. He was in London for the tail end of the winter session, and then in Northumberland on some estate business, and his absence from Ashvale gave the house a quality like a sentence not yet finished. Mrs. Pelham spoke of him as one speaks of a weather system, with precise attention to its approach and no particular warmth. "His Grace prefers the library at a cooler temperature than you might expect," she said, "and he does not like to be addressed on the stairs." "I shall remember," Nora said. "He notices things," Mrs. Pelham said, "more than most gentlemen do." She said it without judgment, merely as a statement of fact, but there was something in her voice that Nora filed away carefully, the way she filed away all facts about the household she moved through. He notices things. She would not give him anything worth noticing. The Duke of Asheville had arrived in April, in the late afternoon, on a horse the color of charcoal, and Nora had seen him from the kitchen passage window as he dismounted in the courtyard below. He was 34 years old, tall and lean rather than broad, with dark hair pushed back from his face, and the look of a man who had been wearing a particular expression for so long it had become his face, not cold, exactly, but closed, the way a house is closed when no one is expecting visitors. He handed his reins to the groom without looking at him, which she had noted, and then looked up at the house for a long moment, before going inside, which she had also noted. She did not see him again for 3 weeks, which was precisely how the household's division of worlds was supposed to work. The household's division of worlds held until May, when a dinner party of 14 guests for Lord and Lady Fenmore produced the sort of crisis that reveals the true grain of every person in a house. 3 bottles of claret were delivered corked. The third footman cut his hand on a decanter stopper and had to be sent to the kitchen, and Lady Hargreave, the Duke's widowed aunt who managed the domestic affairs of Asheville with the precision of a general, took to her room at 4 in the afternoon with a headache and left the evening's arrangements in limbo. Nora reorganized the wine cellar allocations, trained the second footman through the sequence for a 14-cover service, bandaged the third footman's hand with the linens from her own mending kit, and had the drawing room laid and the flowers rearranged before the first carriage arrived. She did all of this in the back passages and the cellar and the flower room and the silver pantry, visible to no one in the dining room or the drawing room, present nowhere except precisely where she was needed. The Duke of Asheville passed through the back passage at 20 minutes past 6 with his cravat half-tied, searching for his valet, who was in the attic with a second footman learning the correct placement of wine glasses at speed. Nora was on the back stairs with a tray of freshly polished candlesticks, and she stood aside to let him pass. He stopped. She had not expected him to stop. "The dinner service is in order?" he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Hargreave is indisposed." "I am aware, Your Grace. The arrangements have been managed." He looked at her for a moment, not the quick glance of a man noting an obstruction, but something more measured, as though he were revising an estimate he had not realized he had made. "You are Baxter." "Yes, Your Grace." He said nothing further and went on up the stairs, and Nora went on down them, and the dinner was entirely without incident, and Lady Fenmore told Lady Hargreave the following morning that the flowers had been exactly right. If you are curious what he thought of her in that passage, know only this: he did not know yet. Neither did she. Lady Hargreave recovered from her headache by the following morning and resumed the oversight of Asheville with the comprehensive interest in her nephew's circumstances that she had maintained for the 11 years since his wife had died. Her name had been Cecily, the Duchess, and she had been 26 years old and in perfect health, and she had been dead within a fortnight of the fever breaking. Lady Hargreave did not speak of her. No one in the household spoke of her. There was a miniature of her in a silver frame in the library, placed on the shelf behind the left-hand chair by the fire, and it had been turned to face the wall, and no one moved it. Nora had dusted around it once, in February, and she had not moved it either. She had simply noted the direction it faced, and understood it as a fact of the house. The way the creaking third stair and the north-facing window in the yellow bedroom were facts of the house. structural, and not to be argued with. What she had not been prepared for was how long a man could grieve without anyone in his household being permitted to notice. The testing had begun, as best she could trace it, in the second week of June. It was not aimed at her. She was quite certain of that, or nearly certain. Lady Hargreaves' newest companion had arrived from Bath on the 10th of June, a Miss Alderton, 20 years old and pretty in the pink, dimpled way that drawing rooms tend to approve of on sight. She had been brought in for reasons that the household understood without discussing, which was to say that Lady Hargreave intended her as a candidate for the Duke's attention, and the Duke's attention was being measured and calibrated and brought to bear in the way a man applies himself to a problem he has not yet decided whether to solve. The tests were small and not unkind. A book placed on a shelf where it did not belong to, see if she would replace it correctly. A question asked about the arrangement of flowers in the morning room, with no indication of the preferred answer. A specific servant sent into a room with an unusual instruction to observe whether she would presume to correct the instruction or simply execute it. Nora was the servant sent with the unusual instruction on a Thursday in mid-July, and the instruction was to bring the morning room fire up to a heat that was, in her professional judgment, about 12 degrees too warm for comfort. She knocked, entered, tended the fire, and withdrew. She did not comment on the instruction, either to Miss Alderton or to anyone else. She did not perform her opinion of it in any way. She simply did her work and left. She did not know that he had been watching from the connecting door. What he saw was a young woman in a white cap and a dark dress moving across a room with complete attention to what she was doing and absolutely no attention to the fact of being observed. He had tested servants before, generally to useful effect, because most people, when they believe themselves unobserved, reveal themselves. And what most people revealed was a kind of low-grade larceny of time and attention, a tendency to slow down, to shift, to arrange their face differently when the scrutiny lifted. Nora did not slow down. She was not arranging her face for anyone. It was simply her face, intent on the fire, and then on the placement of the tongs, and then, briefly, on something in the middle distance that he could not see, but that appeared to interest her for a moment, before she settled it and left. He had found this, in a way he would not have been able to articulate directly. Curious. She had come to Ashvale 9 months ago, Mrs. Pelham had said, on the strength of a good letter and 3 good minutes of conversation about fire grates. He had asked no other questions. He had returned to his correspondence. He had thought about it again on Saturday. The morning room in October was where matters arrived at their turn. The cat, whose name was Octavian, and who belonged to Lady Hargreave in the way that cats belong to people, which is to say on terms entirely of his own choosing, had been sleeping in the morning room since September, because the window there caught the last good light of the afternoon. And Nora had developed the habit of checking on him in the early morning when she passed through to bank the fire before the household rose. She had been talking to herself that morning in the way one does when one is alone. Not carelessly. She was never careless. More in the manner of a woman who had spent a great deal of her life in service, which means a great deal of her life not saying what she thought, and who had learned to say it. Briefly. To empty rooms. As a kind of private accounting, she had said what she said about the testing and the trespass, and she had finished tidying the embroidery silks and set them in their proper basket, and she had straightened the cushion on the settee, and she had left. She was not aware, for 4 days, that she had been heard. The awareness arrived on Thursday evening, when she was descending the back stairs with a tray of water jugs and met the Duke coming up. He was in his evening coat, returning from dinner at the Fenmore house, and they stopped in the narrow landing in that particular configuration that the back stairs produce. too close for the correct distance of their respective stations, and too occupied with physical navigation to manage the usual small negotiations of eye contact. "Baxter," he said. "Your Grace." She shifted the tray to free the railing for him. He did not move for a moment. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention she had noted in the back passage in May, though the calculation in it was different now, less estimating and more confirmed. "You have been at Ashvale since January," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "You have not given notice." She did not know what to make of that. "No, Your Grace." "Most people give notice," he said, which was not an explanation. He went past her on the stairs, and she stood on the landing for a moment after he had gone, her hand steady on the tray, her pulse not steady, a fact she noted with the same professional detachment she applied to fires and flower arrangements. And then she continued down to the kitchen. She thought, sitting in the kitchen afterward with her hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold while she was not attending to it, that she was in danger of noticing him too much. The trouble was that the more she noticed him, the more there was to notice, which was not a comfortable discovery. The miniature behind the left-hand chair. The way he went very still when someone mentioned the spring season. The way he never, in all the months she had observed him, sat in the right-hand chair by the library fire, only ever in the left, with the turned miniature at his back. 11 years was a long time to grieve. It was a long time to refuse to grieve, which she suspected was what he was actually doing. She told none of this to anyone. She carried it in the part of herself she kept back from service, that small, persistent interior that no household could lay claim to, and she set it beside the other things she had noted and filed and would never speak aloud, and she drank her cold tea, and she went to bed. The conversation that undid everything happened on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, when Nora was in the back passage laying out the clean press cloths from the laundry, and Lady Hargreave swept through from the Green Saloon with 2 of her visiting friends, and did not lower her voice. "She is adequate," Lady Hargreave said, of someone who was clearly not present, and the 2 friends made the sounds of women hearing a verdict they had been waiting for. Adequate and perfectly willing, and absolutely without that particular quality that makes a man stop thinking about something else. "A shame," said one of the friends, whose voice Nora recognized as Lady Fenmore. "It is what it is," said Lady Hargreave. "A clever girl might have done it. Miss Alderton is merely pretty, and Ashvale will not be moved by pretty. He needs a girl who is not afraid of silence." "Is there such a girl?" said the other friend. "Somewhere," said Lady Hargreave, and the door to the Green Saloon closed behind them, and Nora stood in the back passage for a moment with a press cloth in each hand, and then she went on with her work. She was aware, in a way she had not been fully aware before, that she was afraid of nothing here, except wanting something she was not permitted to want. The crisis, when it came through Mrs. Pelham. On the Monday of the last week of October, Mrs. Pelham called Nora into her sitting room and shut the door, and stood by the window in the manner of a woman who has received information she does not know what to do with. She was a practical person, and not given to circumlocution, and she said directly, "Lady Hargreave has asked me to speak to you." Nora waited. "It has been reported to Lady Hargreave that you were heard speaking in the morning room on a recent morning." Mrs. Pelham paused. Speaking of His Grace's household management in a manner that was, according to the report, not entirely respectful. Nora's hands were very still on her apron. "The report was made by Mr. Graves," said Mrs. Pelham, meaning the first footman, who had come to Ashvale 2 months ago from the Fenmore house, and who had made clear from his first week that he considered the management of Ashvale insufficiently rigorous by his standard. "I see," said Nora. Lady Hargreave wishes to know if the report is accurate. Nora said. Mr. Graves was not in the morning room on that morning. Mrs. Pelham's eyes sharpened slightly. How do you know? Because I checked the room before I entered it, Nora said. It was empty. A silence held between them, the quality of which Nora could not quite read. Then where did Mr. Graves hear what he reported hearing? Mrs. Pelham said, and her voice had shifted from its official register into something more careful. I do not know, said Nora. And she did not with certainty, though the memory of a curtain and the toe of a boot had been sitting at the edge of her mind since the moment she heard Mr. Graves's name. I would not object to explaining myself to Lady Hargreave directly. Lady Hargreave has referred the matter to His Grace. The silence after this was different. I understand, Nora said. She was shown to the library at 4:30, while the light was going out of the west window, and the fire was the room's primary source of warmth. He was standing at the near end of the shelves, not in either of his chairs, not at his desk, which she read as she read everything, as a deliberate positioning. She stood inside the door with her hands at her sides, and she did not look at the miniature behind the left-hand chair, though she was acutely aware of it. Mrs. Pelham has told you the nature of the complaint, he said. Yes, Your Grace. Mr. Graves reports hearing you speak in the morning room on the morning of the 14th. Yes, Your Grace. He looked at her. He was not in the room. No, Your Grace. I was. She had known it since the moment Mrs. Pelham said Mr. Graves's name, and still the confirmation of it landed in her chest with a specific weight. Yes, she said. I worked that out, Your Grace. Something changed in his face. It was not quite surprise, more a slight recalibration, the expression of a man whose estimate is being revised for the second time by the same person. You are not going to deny what you said. No, Your Grace. You said that testing servants without their knowledge was a trespass. I said that being watched without one's knowledge is a trespass, she said. Yes, I stand by that. He was very still. The fire made a small sound behind him. Most people in your position would deny it. I am aware, said Nora. Most people in my position cannot afford the truth. I find I cannot afford to give it up. The words were out before she had weighed them properly, and she felt the air of the room shift slightly with them, the weight of what she had just said settling over both of them like the first cold of a season. She had meant something by them that was both more and less than what the sentence directly contained, and she could see, in the quality of his attention, that he was aware of that. You have been at Ashvale since January, he said. Yes, Your Grace. You reorganized the dinner service in May. She said nothing, because that was not a question. You said, in the morning room, he said slowly, that you wondered whether I had considered that the people I test are simply tired. I said that, she said. Are you tired? She looked at him. Not a quick look, not a servant's flicker toward and away, but a direct and measured assessment of a question she was deciding whether to answer honestly. I am not tired of Ashvale, she said. He said nothing for a long moment. The fire made another small sound. Nora kept her hands very still, and her breathing even, and her face as neutral as she could manage, which was not as neutral as she would have liked, because she was in the library with him, and the last of the October light was dying behind her, and something in the room was shifting in a way she could feel, but not name. What are you tired of? He said. She had not expected that. She made the small adjustment of a person recalibrating under unexpected conditions. Of being a fact in rooms I do not get to stay in, she said, and the words were out again before she could stop them. Honest and unornamented, and entirely too much of herself for this room, for his question, for the life she was living. He said, Baxter. Your Grace. You are not dismissed, he said. Go have your supper. She went. She did not understand entirely what had happened. She thought about it for 3 days. The shift at Ashvale was not swift. It did not announce itself. It worked the way weather works, in the quality of the light before you can see the clouds, in a particular weight of air that is not yet anything you can name. He found reasons to be in rooms that she also occupied. Not contrived reasons exactly, more a recalibration of his movements that resulted in a series of encounters that none of them, taken alone, would constitute anything, but that accumulated, over the fortnight following the library meeting, into a pattern that Nora was aware of with her whole body, even as she refused to draw any conclusion from it. He stopped on the stairs when she was going up them and asked about the temperature in the East Wing bedrooms. He came to the flower room door when she was arranging the weekly order and stood in the doorframe for a moment, before apparently deciding he had nothing to say and going away again. He asked Mrs. Pelham, within Nora's hearing, whether the brown-eyed woman from the back passage had yet been given a day off. Mrs. Pelham told her this, with an expression of pure professional neutrality that was doing considerable work. He asked, said Nora. Specifically the brown-eyed woman? Those were his words. Nora looked at the mending basket in her lap. I shall take a half-day on Wednesday, Mrs. Pelham. I have already arranged it, said Mrs. Pelham. He found her in the garden on the Wednesday morning, before her half-day. In the cold kitchen garden where she had gone to cut the last of the rosemary for the drying cupboard. He came through the gate from the grounds with mud on his boots from the meadow path, and stopped when he saw her. And they stood in the kitchen garden in the pale November light, with the frost on the beds between them, and the smell of rosemary sharp and cold in the air. She thought, with the clarity that very cold air sometimes produces, that she was in real danger. The frost came early, he said. Yes, Your Grace. She kept her hands occupied with the rosemary stems. He crossed the garden toward her, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided something and is not going to retract it. He stopped at the width of the bed from her and looked at the rosemary in her hands, and then at her face, with that particular quality of attention that she had, by now, learned was not calculation, but something more like an attempt to see something clearly. You said, he began, and then stopped. She waited. You said you were not tired of Ashvale, he said. In the library. I remember, she said. I have been at Ashvale, he said, for 11 years, and I am tired of Ashvale, and I am tired of the way it holds everything still. He said it in the level, declarative way that she associated with him, the way of a man who does not perform his sentences, but simply means them. I have been managing the stillness for 11 years, and I have gotten quite good at it, and I have recently been told, by a woman speaking to a cat, that managing stillness by watching people from behind curtains is not a test of character. It is a trespass. She could not speak for a moment. He said, I was not, in the morning room, testing you. What were you doing? She asked. He looked at the frost on the garden beds and then back at her. Hiding, he said. It was the most honest word she had heard from him. It was the most honest word she had heard in any household she had ever served in, stripped of all its protective padding, just the bare fact of it in the cold air between them. She said gently, because gentleness was the only right response to a word that vulnerable. From what? From the fact that I'm going to have to stop, he said, eventually. Sooner. Now. He looked at her hands on the rosemary. I had a wife, he said. She died in the spring of 1812, 11 years ago. I believed that grief was something I could manage the way I managed everything else, with sufficient application and the correct arrangement of one's circumstances. I arranged my circumstances very carefully. I turned her miniature to the wall. Nora looked at her hands. I thought, he said, that if I did not look at it, I would eventually stop noticing it was there. Did you? She asked. No, he said. He paused. You know about the miniature. I dust that shelf, Your Grace. Something in his face shifted. Not quite grief. More grief's recognition. The look of a man who has been seen around something he constructed to prevent being seen. I have been running Ashvale, he said, like a test I haven't passed yet. A test I keep administering, because if I set it down, I have to admit that I cannot administer my way out of the fact that she is gone. She did not say anything. She let the silence do what it needed to. I watched you in the morning room, he said, because you moved through it like someone who was actually present in it. Not performing yourself, not arranging yourself for observation. Simply there. He paused. I have not been simply there in 11 years. The rosemary was cold in her hands, and her fingers were going numb from the frost, but she did not set it down. She said, "The miniature faces the wall because you cannot bear to see her, or because you cannot bear to see her and feel nothing." He was very still. "I am sorry," she said immediately. That was not a question I had any right to ask." "It was precisely the right question," he said. He said it quietly, with the weight of a man who has been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone to ask the correct thing. I am afraid it is the latter. I am afraid that one day I will look at it and feel nothing, and that will mean she is truly gone. She understood that. She understood it in a way that had nothing to do with his rank and nothing to do with hers. Purely human. One person to another in a cold garden in November. She said, "I do not think that is how it works." "No? I think she is already truly gone," she said, as gently as she could say anything. "And you are still here, and that is the part you have not yet made peace with." The frost crackled somewhere in the beds. A thrush called once from the bare cherry tree at the end of the garden, and then was silent. He looked at her for a long time. Not the assessing look, not the watchful look, but something that had given up on assessment altogether and was simply looking. "Baxter," he said, "Your Grace. Your name, your first name." She did not hesitate. "Nora," she said. "Nora." He said it the way one says something one has been keeping back, carefully, with full intention. "I'm going to ask Mrs. Pelham to have a word with you about a change in your situation at Ashvale, and I'm asking you now, before she does, whether such a change would be welcome." She looked at his hands, which were very still at his sides, and at the frost on the garden beds, and at the bare cherry tree, and then at his face, which was open in a way she had not seen it before, and was not, she thought, going to be this open again in a garden in November, with a woman holding cold rosemary in both hands. "Yes," she said. "It would." He nodded once. He turned back toward the gate, and then stopped. "The miniature," he said, "when you dust that shelf." "Yes?" "You may turn it back," he said, "if you would." He went back through the gate, and Nora stood in the kitchen garden for a moment longer, with the cold rosemary in her numb hands and the November light thin and pale overhead, and she allowed herself, very briefly, to feel the full measure of what had just happened in this garden, which was considerable. And then she tucked it away and went inside. Mrs. Pelham called her that same afternoon. The word Lady Hargreave used in the drawing room 2 days later, when her nephew informed her of his intention. was, in its way, a verdict, she said. A maid, in the precise tone of a woman whose entire social architecture is being asked to accommodate a structural impossibility. You intend to offer for a maid. I intend to offer, said the Duke, for Nora Baxter, who has managed my household more capably than it has been managed in a decade, who told me a truth I needed to hear, and who has been at Ashvale since January, without once performing herself for my benefit. He was standing by the fireplace with his hands behind his back and his face entirely composed. I would be grateful, Aunt, for your acceptance of this. I do not require it. Lady Hargreave sat with this for a long moment. One saw her thinking, in the way she thought, carefully and without sentiment. She had wanted the Duke to stop hiding. She had wanted him to stop administering his grief like a household that needed running. She had not, it was true, specifically imagined a maid. She said, finally, "She is not without character." "She is the best of character," he said. "You heard her speak in the morning room." "I was behind the curtain," he said, and something crossed his face that was almost, in the quietest possible way, the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he thought was lost. She did not know. She spoke entirely honestly. "I cannot say the same for everyone I have offered my attention to in 11 years. Lady Hargreave looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at her nephew, who was standing straighter than she had seen him stand in a very long time, and whose face had something in it she had forgotten about, which was the quality of a man who is waiting, not managing. "Well," she said. And this was itself a kind of yielding. "Send Mrs. Pelham to have a word with the girl." It was not a blessing. It was a door left ajar, and Nora knew, when Mrs. Pelham delivered the account of it, that a door left ajar by Lady Hargreave was a considerable thing. The formal drawing room was where it was settled. He found her there on the Saturday morning, when the house was quiet and the light came clean and cold through the long windows, and the fire was steady, and the room smelled faintly of beeswax and the roses that had been the last of the autumn cutting. Nora had dressed as well as she was able, and stood near the window and told herself that she was not afraid. She was afraid of exactly one thing, that she would say yes and mean it entirely, and find, in 3 months or 6, that she had simply exchanged one kind of invisibility for another. He came in and looked at her, and said, without preamble, "You are afraid of something." She said, "I am afraid of being a fact in a room, rather than a person in it." "Yes," he said. He crossed the room until he was close enough that the warmth of him was a distinct presence in the cold air. "I know. I have not given you sufficient reason to believe I know the difference." He said it with the particular weight of a man acknowledging a fair charge. "I have been watching people from behind curtains for years. It was easier than looking directly." She looked at him directly. He said, "Nora, I am looking now." She said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that was not simply yes, and yes was what she felt in her hands and her chest, and the careful, composed part of herself that she had kept back from every household she had ever served in, and was not, in this room, keeping back. He reached out and took her hand, and she felt the warmth of his fingers through her own, and the particular held quality of someone who is touching carefully, with full awareness of what they are doing. He said, "Will you stay?" "Not as a maid, as Nora. As mine, if you will have me." "I will," she said. He held her hand for a long moment and looked at her with the face she had watched all autumn. The closed face opened now, the managed face simply present, and she thought that this was what 11 years of grief looked like when it finally turned toward something. Not gone, not erased, but set down gently, like a thing that had served its purpose and could rest. The miniature in the library had been turned to face the room. She had turned it herself on the Thursday, with careful hands, and she had looked at the small, painted face for a moment. The young woman with the light expression, 26 years old, and entirely unaware of what 11 years of absence would cost the man who loved her. Nora had straightened the frame and stepped back, and felt something she did not have a word for. Something between sorrow and a kind of permission. "In the drawing room," he said. "She would have liked you." Nora looked at him. "Cecily," he said. She had no patience for people who manage things when what was needed was feeling them. The name, spoken aloud for perhaps the first time in years in this house, hung in the clean November air between them, and then settled, and the room was quiet. By the spring, Ashvale was different. It was different in the way that a house is different when the air moves through it again, when the windows are opened in the morning, and the cold has gone from the corridors, and something that had been held at a remove has been allowed to approach. The long gallery still had its faded tapestries. The staircase banister was still polished to its warm reddish bronze. In the library, the 2 chairs by the fire had been moved, just slightly, so that they faced each other rather than the fire alone. The miniature of Cecily stood on the shelf between them, turned toward the room. Nora had dusted it in March and set it carefully back, and she had noted that it had not been touched since, that it sat in its small silver frame in the morning light and was simply there, a presence that no longer needed to be hidden. She sat in the right-hand chair that April afternoon, and he was in the left, and neither of them was hiding behind anything, and the fire made its small familiar sound. And outside the window, the grounds were greening into the first real warmth of the year. He was reading, and she was writing a letter to her sister in Stilton. And the room was quiet in the way a room is quiet when 2 people are entirely at ease in it. No arrangements required. No tests being administered. No curtains drawn against the truth of things. She set down her pen and looked at the miniature. He looked up. She said, "She had your eyes." He looked at the miniature for a moment, and something in his face moved through a feeling she was glad she was there to see. "Her eyes were green," he said. "Mine are gray." "Yes," she said. "But the expression, the directness." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She would have called it stubbornness." "So do I," said Nora. And something in his face completed itself. The expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was trying to go, and had found it, against all expectation, warm. The rosemary she had cut on that November morning was dried, and in the still room now, done with its purpose, and the kitchen garden was bare under the spring sky. She had kept a single stem of it in her room all winter, in a small blue glass on the windowsill, and that morning she had seen that it had finally lost its color and its scent entirely, and she had taken it to the window and held it for a moment, gray and brittle and perfectly itself, and then she had set it down in the light and come to find him. He was here. She was here. And the house was open to the morning.